Hello and welcome to a new Italian PNC video. Today we will be doing something completely different. I will be giving Discord, my Discord server, the possibility to rewrite the treaties that have to do with World War I. So everybody knows what World War I was. It was the Great War, the biggest conflict humanity had ever seen until the Second World War, of course. In this conflict, the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria fought against the Entente, where Serbia, Russia, France, Britain, and later even Italy and the USA would fight against each other in a conflict full of trenches, poisonous gases, and some of the worst violences humanity had ever seen before. The treaties that followed the First World War were some of the most awful ever made. They were completely irrespective of the nations that lost the war. Germany had to be in extreme debt to repay the war reparations that were impossible to repay. The Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire would be completely dismantled and replaced by new states. The Russian Empire, while even on the winning side, would fall to the revolution of Lenin and his Bolshevik supporters. On the other side, the Entente would indeed come out victorious of the conflict, but not without large concessions, while all these nations were starving and their populations died in the millions. With that said, I gave Discord, my Discord server, Italian PNC project server, the possibility to rewrite these treaties. But how? Well, I gave the possibility to the members to become ambassadors, where they could be ambassadors of one or other nation and come to vote for resolutions of border and monetary war reparation changes that would be part of the treaties at the end of the war. The first part I worked on was Germany. In this simulation, people were given from 3 to 8 options depending on the conference to vote on, and each of these resolutions would be passed at a number of higher votes. Finally, the entirety of these resolutions would be put into one final map to showcase the new world that would be created after all of these resolutions passed. So let's immediately start. First, the first conference, the one that had to do with the Western Front. Here, Germany and France, as well as Britain and Belgium, fought against each other, free on one side and Germany on the other. This was one of the most brutal fronts of the war. Millions died, and in horrible ways, through the trench warfare that was to become the most famous part of World War I. The Flanders Fields is one of the places that still manages to remind people of how horrific this war was. After the war, the French had one objective in mind: reclaiming Alsace-Lorraine, one of their most importantly lost territories that they had lost previously to the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. In that war, the Prussian army, together with the other armies of the German states, managed to defeat the French one and unite Germany in Versailles and annex Alsace-Lorraine, which was considered a core French province by the French. So, in this front, the major objective of France was to reclaim that territory, while the rest of the claims for the other powers of the winning side was to basically get monetary compensation for their losses in the war. The 4 options were a moderate approach, an official approach, a land over money approach, and a French ambitions achieved approach. The first option was to have France only annex the territories in Alsace-Lorraine that have a French ethnic majority. Also, this option would be moderate, as in the territorial changes would be minor, but also the monetary amount would be minor, as instead of 130 billion marks, the Germans would only have to pay around 80 billion marks, which of course is still a high amount, but it's not completely impossible to repay. The second approach is the official approach, the one that happened in the real Treaty of Versailles. In this treaty, Belgium expands in Eupen-Malmedy, a territory next to their border, France reclaims the entirety of Alsace-Lorraine, Germany has to pay 130 billion marks, and finally the Rhineland area of Germany is demilitarized, to not allow Germany to ever invade from that area again. The third approach, land over money, was to make French and Belgian desires of territorial expansions completed, while reducing the amount the Germans had to pay to them in war reparations. Here, the French would annex the Saarland as well, and Eupen-Malmedy would be expanded for the Belgians. But on the other side, Germany would only have to pay 35 billion marks, an even smaller amount than the one in the moderate approach. Finally, the last of these approaches is the French ambitions achieved approach. Here, France would annex everything west of the Rhine River. This is to complete their desires to create strong natural boundaries under the concept of natural borders of the French nation, which explained that everything west of the Rhine would have to become France in order to defend itself from their enemies. On the other hand, Belgium, while being on the winning side, would be considered a useless ally, because it wasn't enough to stop the Germans from advancing. Therefore, it would be split along ethnical and linguistic lines by the French, which would take Wallonia, the more French-inclined region of Belgium, and by the Netherlands, which would annex Flanders, the more similar part to them. Of the 4 options I gave to the server members and ambassadors, one was the one that won. And it was by no small margin. It was a definitive answer. People chose the moderate approach, which means that only the French ethnic territories in Alsace-Lorraine would be annexed by France. And at the same time as that, the Germans would have to pay less war reparations than they had to pay in our timeline. But with all of that said, this means that the French are probably not that happy with these results in the conference. Next, we have the second conference, the question of Schleswig-Holstein. This is a territory that saw no fighting in the war, yet it was given away from Germany to Denmark, because of its Danish population and also because the Entente, the winners of the Great War, wanted to punish Germany for its defeat. In this conference, I gave 4 options once more. The first one is the no approaches taken approach, which means that nothing happens in Schleswig-Holstein. Since Denmark never joined the war and there was no fighting on the land, there is no need for Germany to lose the territory. On the second approach, we have the official approach. Only the parts where Danish people are the majority become parts of Denmark. The third approach is the regionalist approach. Not only would Denmark annex the areas where the Danish people live, but they would annex the entire region of Schleswig, which was historically part of the Danish realm. And together with that, the island of Helgoland would be given back to the British Empire, which used to rule that land before the Helgoland-Zanzibar Treaty, which was established with the German Empire. But since the German Empire would be no more, there is no need for the actual island to be ruled by Germany. Finally, we have the restoration approach. This is definitely the harsher approach in contrast to the first one. In this case, not only both Schleswig and Holstein are given to Denmark despite no war being fought in those territories, but the entirety of the Kingdom of Hanover is re-established and reincorporated as a part of the Greater British Empire, becoming a personal union partner with Britain. Since this territory used to be ruled by the same monarchs that ruled the British Empire, meaning the ones that ruled England and Scotland and Ireland. Finally, the island of Helgoland would be returned to Britain, and the Duchy of Saxe-Lauenburg, which used to be in a personal union with Denmark, much like Hanover was in a personal union with Britain, would become once more in a personal union with Denmark. Out of these 4 options, much like the first conference we saw, the first approach was the one decided to win. 103 people voted for this approach, the vast majority. But it wasn't so one-sided. In fact, people were starting to understand that if the ambassadors did not bind together, Germany would have all of these as a win, because of the high amount of pro-German sentiment, because of the injustices it had to fight against after the war. So over 70 people still voted for the harshest approach against Germany. For now, the first approach wins, but we will see how in time this anti-German sentiment rises between the voters. The third conference has to do with the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was the one where Germany saw their major territorial losses in the real treaty during the end of the war. This area was contested between Poland and Germany. Now with Poland being made a kingdom and now an independent republic under its own little revolution, the Polish and the German had conflicting interest, as a lot of people in the German Empire are Polish, and a lot of these territories are historically part of Poland. And Poland does not have a port. It does not have access to the sea, the Baltic Sea, which means that Poland is striving to find more access to the sea and reduce German territories in the area, despite the fact that there are millions of Germans living in this zone. The 4 approaches I gave to the voters and the ambassadors are similar to the ones I did with the other 2. The first one is the stability approach. Germany would see some territories given to the Polish, but Silesia, East Prussia and Pomerania would be completely untouched, meaning they would not lose an inch of coast, and the entire issue of the Polish corridor would never come to even be, because of the Germans maintaining the entire coastline on the Baltic Sea, which also means that Poland would not see access to the sea. Then the second option, the official approach, would be the one that was taken IRL, which means Poland would annex those territories where the Polish populations lived and would hold two plebiscites in the area of Masuria and East Prussia and Upper Silesia. In these two areas, only a small part of the population actually voted to join Poland, despite most of the territories being populated by majorities of Polish people. So some of these territories were given to Poland, but most of them remained with Germany. But most importantly, the free city of Danzig was established, a new and independent state which, while being influenced by Poland, would act as some sort of buffer state between the Polish and the Germans. Then we come to the ethnocentric approach. This is a name given to those approaches that had to do with the map being as most ethnically accurate as possible. There are many of these approaches we will see in the following conferences and with the following states. In this case, the ethnocentric approach of Poland and Germany. Poland is to be given every single territory in Germany which has Polish majority populations, which mean all the territories they had before and also the territories where the plebiscites lost. So the entirety of Upper Silesia as well as the entirety of southern Eastern Prussia would be given to Poland. Something else would happen which I forgot to mention earlier. The territory of Memeland, which was a territory in the north of East Prussia, would be given to the United Nations, or the League of Nations as it was called at the time. But let's go to the last option, the Polish ambitions achieved approach. This is the harshest approach we have seen yet against the Germans. Not only do the Polish gain everything they gained in the last approach, except for some minor territories in southern Eastern Prussia, but they also gain more territories in Pomerania, the entirety of the free city of Danzig is completely dissolved and incorporated into Poland proper, and they also gain the majority of Silesia. And as if all of this was not enough, they even managed to create a new and independent kingdom in Prussia, giving it as a safe place for the German monarchy to flee to. In fact, as most of us know, the German Empire would end after World War I, which would be succeeded by the Weimar Republic, a republic in Germany which was very unstable and ineffective. Here, the republic still takes a place in the rest of Germany. But with this approach, the rest of Eastern Prussia is given to the German royal family, which now creates a Kingdom of Prussia, separated from Germany, a new and independent state, of course under Polish protection. Out of all these four approaches, would you guess which one won? Yes, it's the last one. It's the one that was most against the Germans, which is crazy considering what approaches won in the last two conferences, where clearly Germany was favored. So now Germany sees better approaches in the north and the west, but in the east, it sees the worst things happening. But it's not over for Germany, because one last and most important conference has to be held, the one about territorial integrity. In fact, many people wanted to see Germany ended after World War I. They didn't just want to see the end of the German Empire or end of the colonial empire. They wanted to see the end of the concept of Germany as a united state. They wanted to see it gone, reduced to the multiple statelets that existed previous to the German unification in the Franco-Prussian War. The four options given for the question of integrity are: first, the official approach, the one where all the territories we're not talking about yet are to remain with Germany and remain part of the German New Republic, the Weimar Republic. The second approach is a limited recognition approach, where some of the states that would declare independence during German instability post-war would be recognized by the League of Nations, these being the Bavaria and Saxony. In the third approach, basically the same thing as the last one, plus one more, which is the Baden-Württemberg Republic. Finally, the French plans for Germany approach, the fourth resolution, which is definitely the most harsh one against Germany. This one is awful. If you thought the one with the Polish was awful, this one is increasingly bad. Not only is Germany completely disassembled, but it is created in a way that makes its entire new borders completely difficult to manage for the new states. These French plans were made at the height of French resentment for the Germans during the war, so it makes sense why they are so punishing towards Germany. Places like Bavaria, Saxony, Baden-Württemberg, Hesse, Hanover, Oldenburg, Mecklenburg, and even Prussia would be recreated as independent states. And even more territories would be given away to other nations, such as the Ruhr, which was a very important region industrially for Germany, which would be under the League of Nations, and also Lower Silesia, as well as Lusatia, where the Sorbs live. Out of these 4 options, the contest was high. Many expected that the pro-German sentiment would lose against the increasingly anti-German sentiment the ambassadors were cooking. But in the end, the pro-German sentiment won, and Germany managed to remain an independent and united republic without any of these places gaining independence. Meaning that yes, while the Eastern Prussian kingdom would remain independent under the treaty that had to be made with the Polish, everything else would remain as it was, with the German Republic somehow even having a decent outcome compared to the one they'd had in our timeline. As while yes, they would lose more territories in the east, they would still have to pay less reparations in terms of money, but also have less territorial losses in the west, with the French annexing only the French majority areas of Alsace-Lorraine and the Danish not getting anything. Now that Germany is done, let's go east. Brest-Litovsk Treaty. This treaty was taken between the Germans and the Russians at the end of the Eastern Front. As Russia was collapsing, the Germans managed to create a peace deal that they forced on the Russians, where they would annex more lands in Poland and create multiple puppet states all the way from the Baltic to the Caucasus. While these plans for Germany's victory in the east were trying to be taken into action at the end of the war, the surrender from Germany meant that these plans were completely destroyed. And now the eastern parts of this treaty would be left completely to the chaos of the interwar period, as the Soviets tried to re-include their areas that were once Russian into the Soviet Union, and some of these new independent states tried to completely unite with each other to create more important places. One of these places that had to unite in our timeline was Romania. In fact, while Romania already exists as an independent state, the entire area known as Bessarabia, modern-day Moldova, was a completely different subject. They had been part of the Russian Empire for decades, and only now were able to achieve independence. We have 4 options for the Romanian unification with Bessarabia, also known as Moldova. The first one says separation. No unification should be held for Romania and Bessarabia, especially considering the fact that Romania only managed to consider the unification with Bessarabia because of a treaty with the Central Powers while the war was still ongoing, which means that the League of Nations actually recognizing this treaty would give more illegitimacy to the League of Nations because they accepted the treaty made by the Central Powers. The second resolution sees unification. It gives Romania the opportunity to unite with Bessarabia. This is the one that was taken in real life. In fact, Romania was allowed by the Central Powers to unite with Bessarabia in exchange for more concessions, and at the end of the war, the Entente recognized the change nonetheless. The third option is across the Dniester. In fact, not only is Romania able to unite with Moldova, but it is also given the chance to gain some liminal lands over to the Dniester River, which in this timeline are the lands of Transnistria, which, as many of you already know, are a huge deal for multiple reasons. It's not a very big change, but it still means that Romania can defend itself better from possible invasions that are outside of this river. Finally, we have a 4th option, Greater Romania approach. Romania is a valuable ally to the Entente. While of course their successes were limited during the war, this does not mean that their efforts shouldn't be rewarded fairly. Now that Russia can no longer be used as an intended pillar in the east, we will need someone to protect these lands from any radical menace. And who is better at doing that than Romania? Thus, Romania's unification with Moldova should be accepted, and not only that, expanded to all contiguous territories in Russia where Romanians make a substantial minority, Odessa included. This, of course, is very generous to Romania because it means that not only the territories where Romanians live are able to unite with the motherland, but also even more territories where there are no Romanians can become part of Romania. And guess who won the poll between these 4 options? Yes, indeed, the 4th one with the Greater Romania approach. The ambassadors of the Discord server clearly want Romania to succeed. But the question is, do they want Romania to succeed because they prefer Romania over any other power, or do they want Romania to succeed because they know Romania can succeed in other places? We will see that later. The second conference that has to do with the East and the Brest-Litovsk post-treaties has to do with the Polish. Now, this is one of the conferences that was least realistic. Of course, these conferences in this area were held, but there was no real willpower to actually enforce them, because they have to do with the war between the Polish and the Soviet. So I kind of took a gamble. Well, now the simulation is made to make people understand the problems with war resolution and peace treaty making. I still wanted to make a decent Poland and have the people choose what the new borders of the Polish state in the east would be. Meaning that we kind of had to alter history for it, because we have to give 4 options for the people to choose, but of course these options can't be really chosen because it's not up to us whether the Russians or the Polish win the Polish-Soviet war. These 4 options were number 1, end of Poland approach, which means that the Soviet Union completely beats Poland and manages to re-annex all the territories of the Russian Empire in Poland into the Soviet Union, making Poland a Polish SSR, so a socialist Soviet Republic. The resolution number 2 sees an ethnocentric approach. As mentioned earlier, the ethnocentric approaches mean basically the borders are completely made based on the lines of the ethnic map. This means that Poland does kind of win the war, but it does not win the war enough to annex the territories where Polish people do not support it. Meaning that basically Poland only gets the territories which are completely Polish majority, which are shown in this map. The third of these approaches is the official approach, the one that gave rise to the Poland we know in the interwar period of our timeline, which is a greater Poland, one that not only spans the territories that the Polish people populate and make majority in the regions of, but also the territories which are liminal to it and that are populated by Ruthenian, White Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and so on and so forth. And this is the one of the official approach. Notice the lines that are kind of made under Poland. Those signify that the Polish are not only occupying the territories they are shown in the map, but also territories in other ex-Central Power states, in this case Austria-Hungary, where part of Galicia and Lodomeria, which would become a part of the later conference, was already occupied by the Polish at the time of the German surrender, which is where these votes are taking place. Finally, for the fourth approach for the Eastern Front, sees the full Polish victory approach. This is even further than what we had in our timeline. Not only Poland is allowed to annex all those areas, but it gets even to Kiev, and it sieges it, managing to take both Kiev and Minsk, the modern capitals of Ukraine and Belarus. This forces the Russians to not go further with the war, with the risk of the Polish even getting to Moscow, meaning that the Poles managed to annex all of these regions up to Kiev and create a greater Polish realm with borders that resemble the ones of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of the 18th century. Out of these 4 options, I think it's pretty clear the one that won. Most people will be against the Soviet Union in hindsight, so it's pretty normal that people would vote on the 4th resolution. That said, I think this is a realistic approach, because realistically, the people that were ambassadors in the real treaties post-World War I would of course vote against the Soviet Union, seeing it as a threat to survival of the modern nation-state in a capitalist world system. So the 4th option wins, and Poland creates its larger borders, which means that Poland not only is larger in the west, as seen with the treaty with Germany, but now it's also larger in the east, as seen as this full victory with the Soviets. Finally, we have the 3rd conference, the Baltic States. Well, it's not really finally, we have still more to go, but this is interesting. It's the first conference where there are more than 4 options. This time there are 6 options where to choose from for the voters. Since I don't want to dwell too much on them, I'll just and recap them. The first one is the strong, separate and independent approach. This resolution makes the same kind of countries that exist in our timeline with one single change. Lithuania also annexes the region called Vilnius, which is where its modern capital is at. While in this timeline it manages to annex it, in our timeline what happened was that basically it got annexed by Poland because Vilnius was Polish majority at the time, which really pissed the Lithuania off at the time. Which meant that while historically Poland and Lithuania were big allies being part of the same Commonwealth, they kind of fell off after this incident. The second option is the official approach, the one we already talked about. So basically everything the same, but Poland annexes Vilnius. The third approach is more interesting. It's the historical approach. It dismantles the countries that were created by the people of the land and remodels the land into the region states. Some states that, akin to the ones that were made into our timeline, have more historical bases. So Samogitia, Lithuania, Kurland, Latgalia, Lithuania, I meant to say Livonia, and also Estonia. And these states kind of have historical borders while not really following any ethnic boundaries. They're kind of crazy. I don't think anybody would have actually voted for this, but I mean, I wanted to add it because it was a fun option. The fourth option is the ethnocentric approach. Once again, we see how the borders are made out of ethnic approaches. So Poland not only annexes the territories they annexed in our timeline, they even annex more territories, because Polish people were the majority even in parts of Lithuania post the Polish annexation of Vilnius. The Germans, and this is the wildest thing, the Germans remain in Memeland. They remain in the area that was stripped from them in the treaty before. In this case, the Prussians would remain here. And not only that, they annexed some liminal statelets and cities that existed on the coast of Latvia, since they were Baltic German majority. Our liminal changes are the Soviets annexing part of the riverside of the Lake Togu in Estonia and the independence of Livonia, an ethnic group that still existed at the time and was more closely related to Estonians than Latvians. The two last options are the ducal remains approach, which creates a united state between Estonia and Latvia as the United Baltic Duchy, which was the plan originally made by the Germans during the conquest of the region. And the last approach is the partition approach, which means that the Russians, the Finnish, and the Polish partition between themselves the newly independent states of the Baltic. Poland gets Lithuania, re-establishing the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Russia gets Latvia, creating its Baltic fleet out of Riga, and Estonia, seeing linguistic and cultural similarities to Finland, gets annexed by Finland. Out of all of these 6 options, the one that was chosen was the first one. Because people, I guess, just like the old borders and the ones that we have now, and they're more accustomed to them. I don't know why they chose this one, but this one was the one that won. So the next conference we will go to is the Caucasus. The Caucasus conference basically had to do with the actual borders of the countries that would gain independence from the Soviet Union, because after the end of the Russian Empire, all these countries kind of declared independence in the Caucasus. There were very many ethnic groups that wanted independence and autonomy, and so at the end of the war, basically there was an all-out rebellion of multiple groups that were fighting against each other, against the Russians, against the Ottomans, against the Iranians, basically complete chaos in the Caucasus. In the first case, we have the first resolution, which is the de facto approach. So this is like the clearest approach. There are already countries fighting amongst each other. The only thing the League of Nations can do is just come there and stop the fighting and just have the borders that are done at that point, which would be the 11th of November of 1918. So the point where Germany surrendered. So that would be the date which would cause the official borders to be made. So we would see Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia become independent states, as well as the mountainous republic of the Northern Caucasus, which is another kind of thing, but still kind of one of these states. Probably in this case, the country that would have the best deal would be the mountainous republic of the Northern Caucasus, while Azerbaijan would see some of their territories lost, and also Armenia would be extremely small, but it would still contain Karabakh, which is kind of a contentious topic nowadays. Then we have the second resolution, which is the American approach. What was suggested by Woodrow Wilson, which was the president of the United States, was that the 14 points on the autonomy and self-governance of nations would be respected. Therefore, he asked for his commission to accept the pro-Armenian borders, because basically Armenians were the ethnic majority in a lot of the Caucasus, and most other powers didn't really want to respect the fact that they were the ethnic majority and just wanted to give out their land to other powers, since the Caucasus was a very mixed region in terms of ethnic minorities and groups. There were Russians, Iranians, Turkish people, Azerbaijanis, Armenians, Georgian, Abkhazians, Ossetians, and so on and so forth. So it was very hard to actually create precise borders like they were to be made in the rest of Europe. And nonetheless, Woodrow Wilson wanted that to happen for the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis and so on and so forth. So he wanted that. And also he wanted one more thing, which was the creation of a state for the Cossack people, which he identified as a separate group from the Ukrainians. So he asked for a Cossack state to be made in the Northern Caucasus, which kind of was his objective. The third option is the British approach. Despite being allies with the Americans, the British had a very different vision of how the Caucasus should be organized, and only 3 new states should have been recognized for the British. with the rest of the land being taken either by the Soviets, which they realized there was no real way to stop, and also by the Ottoman Empire, which of course was still alive and kicking at that time, even if it was going to be disassembled by the British and the French. That said, so the Georgians, Azerbaijanis and Armenians will be recognized as independent, but Armenia would get the short end of the stick, being very small, and Azerbaijan instead would be the greatest on current timeline. And finally, we have the official approach, the one that actually happened in our timeline, which is the one where the Soviets just managed to annex every single country in the Caucasus that declares independence, but there is a sliver of land that goes from the Black Sea to the border with Iran that is actually taken by the Ottoman and Turkish forces instead of remaining in the Russian Empire, or in this case the Soviet Union. Out of these four options, surprisingly the one that won was the one with basically big Armenia, so the American approach, the Woodrow Wilson approach of the 14 points on autonomy and self-governance of nations. So on one side you should be like happy because, you know, they respected the autonomy of nations, they respected the choice of the people of the land, and the actual ethnic groups were respected, but at the same time, I do not think that the reason this approach won is because of this region. I think it's just because of anti-Turkish sentiment, and we will see on that later. The fifth conference is Eurasia's future. So, as you all know, the Soviet Union didn't really have any recognition by the League of Nations in its infancy, and the countries didn't even trade with it because they all feared the advent of communism in the worldwide scene, and that is why every single Entente power was adverse to the communist cause of the Soviet Union. This provoked that a lot of people just wanted to destroy the Soviet Union before it would rise, which is why I gave 3 possible resolutions, 3 of them available to the ambassadors of the Discord server, wherever to choose upon. So the first one is the official approach. Basically, there is no League of Nations intervention in the Soviet Union. Then we have the second resolution, the Turkestan and Ukraine approach. This is basically a middle point between completely trying to disassemble the Soviet Union and just going completely without anything changing. In this case, we have the places more closer to Entente allies, so basically Turkestan, so the regions that are close to the British Raj in India, and Iran, which was currently under partial British occupation, and Ukraine, which of course was bordering Poland. Those 2 places would be granted independence outside of the Soviet Union, and the League of Nations would recognize them, making it impossible for the Soviet Union to try and invade them. Otherwise, the League of Nations, so all the other nations, would get involved in the war. I don't know if this was very realistic, but it is what people were starting to choose until the third option was revealed, which is the limiting Soviet control approach. So this is definitely unrealistic, and I don't think there was any way to actually make this reality, but basically, in this case, the ambassadors vote on disassembling the non-Russian parts of the Soviet Union, meaning basically that they recognize the fact that the Russian people want a Soviet Union to exist, but at the same time they don't recognize the right of the Soviet people to invade the other nation states that rose up at the end of the Russian Civil War, which means that Ukraine, Belarus, Karelia, the Northern Caucasus Republic, the Kuban Republic, Kazakhstan, Altai, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan would all gain independence and be recognized by the League of Nations. A reminder that Resolution 3 is the most fragile. There's a chance that the Soviets take over the newly independent countries because of how thin the League of Nations support would have to be spread to protect them. So it's basically impossible to actually make this reality, but still people of course voted on the third option, which means that basically the Soviet Union is just Russia-centric and has very little other ethnicities inside of it. I mean, it's still a multicultural state, but not to the point of it was in our timeline. But I said that the de facto situation will be different at the end of the simulation, because realistically there was no way for the actual League of Nations to intervene so hard in the Soviet Union, which meant that basically eventually the Soviet Union would reconquer many of the places that were recognized by the League of Nations. But with that done, we have to go to the next subject. So we have seen Germany. We have seen the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and everything Eastern. Now it's time to go to Central Europe. The time has come to deal with the most ancient of the empires that were parts of the Central Powers, at least by some margin with the Ottoman Empire. That is Austria-Hungary. The Habsburg dynasty had ruled over much of Central Europe for many centuries, but the Great War was like the drop that breaks the camel's back. Now multiple states have declared independence from the country, both inside of its borders and outside. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, West Ukraine's People's Republic, Banat Republic, the states of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, and more. The first conference was about the fact that it wasn't a clear choice whether or not Austria-Hungary was going to cease existing or not at the end of First World War. Of course, there were many countries that had claimed and that were promised territories by the Entente into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but not all of the Entente was sure of the fact that dismantling the Austro-Hungarian Empire was for the best. So in this conference, I took the chances and gave 3 options, 3 resolutions, 3 approaches for the ambassadors to take on the Empire of Austria-Hungary. The first one is minor concessions approach. It means that regardless of the actual treaties that were made before the war, only some places would be given to other nations, and no single country would declare independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, meaning that the Austro-Hungarian Empire would continue to exist, albeit in a smaller form. The second option is the maintain the Habsburgs approach, which means that basically, while the Habsburg realm should be kept, it should be reduced only to the territories where the Magyars and Germans live. For those that do not know, Magyars means Hungarians. Everything else should become independent or join one of the surrounding countries. But the ruling dynasty shouldn't be touched because it's one of the great bringers of stability in Central Europe. As you can see, these borders are kind of iffy. They're basically the union of the borders where Hungarians are the majority and the borders where the Germans are the majority, united into a single state who does not even have a coastline, so it would be very hard to support, but it would still be Austria-Hungary nonetheless. Finally, we have the third option, the official approach, where simply Austria-Hungary will stop existing and it will be dismantled and parts of it given to other countries. Out of these 3 options, it should come out as a surprise, but it really doesn't. And of course, the third option won because people wanted changes and wanted to see the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That said, let's go to the second conference in the Central European sphere. Here is where we re-encounter our old power of Romania. This is the second conference called the Romania's Western Borders Conference, basically. And it has 4 options like the older ones we'd seen in the German conferences. These are the following resolutions. The first one is Hungarian favoritism approach. In this one, only one territory is given to Romania by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that is Bukovina, or southern Bukovina basically, and everything else remains in the Hungarian borders. The second option is the one with ethnic regions approach, which means that 2 regions of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, one being part of the Austrian part of the empire and one being part of the Hungarian parts of the empire, are taken from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and given to Romania. These are the regions where the Romanians make the absolute majority, there is no doubt in that, so it doesn't mean that there will be revolts inside of them. One thing I have not mentioned is the fact that the Banat Republic at this point was a self-declared independent state, the Banat Republic being a state basically in the region of Banat of Austria-Hungary, and this region was currently under its own sovereign rule, but it would not continue for a long time. In this second resolution, the ethnic regions approach, the Banat Republic should continue to exist as an independent, protected and recognized state by the League of Nations, but of course that will be seen for later. Then we have the official approach. So you know how Austria-Hungary was made by Austria and Hungary? Well, Hungary wasn't very happy with the fact that it was part of Austria-Hungary for most of its existence. So many at the start of the war expected Hungary to at some point rebel against the Austro-Hungarians and help the cause of the Entente. But since it didn't happen, many in the Entente saw Hungary to be just a culprit of the war, just as Austria and Germany. That meant that the Hungarians should be punished just as harshly, which means that in this timeline, the official approach, and in our timeline as well, meant that basically Romania would annex major lands that were parts of the Hungarian kingdom and that had Hungarian majority, like the parts in Székelyland and Partium. So in this resolution, Romania gets half of Banat, which is divided between Serbia and Romania. It gets all of Transylvania, both north and south, and also north and south Bukovina. Finally, we have one more resolution, the French plans approved resolution. We have seen basically how the French really wanted to redraw the map of Europe and kind of wanted to weaken all their enemies, and since, as I said, Hungary was seen just as an enemy as Austria and Germany were, the basically decreasing of power of Hungary was seen just as vital as any other punishing of the Central Powers. In this option, we have Romania owning all of the territories that make up Banat, and not only that, they get all of Transylvania, both north and south. Doesn't stop here, they also get all of Bukovina, and if all of this wasn't enough, they also have their borders go all the way to the Tisza River, which was basically what was considered the last natural boundary of Romania against Hungary, except for the Carpathian mountain chain. Out of these 4 options, I was honestly surprised by seeing which one won. Remember earlier when I said that basically what happened with the last conference where Romania's borders were changed was because of the fact that we didn't know whether it was because of the fact that people wanted Romania to win or they just wanted Romania to get a bonus before getting a defeat. Well, it appears that was what it was happening, because in this conference the second option won, which meant that Romania only got southern Bukovina and southern Transylvania, while northern Transylvania and the rest of Austria-Hungary were untouched by Romania. Then we get to the third conference. Now it's time to see the question of Galicia and Lodomeria. So Galicia and Lodomeria was the territory I already mentioned earlier, the one where the Galicia part of Galicia and Lodomeria was already occupied by the Polish, which meant that already it was under complete turmoil. And not only that, the rest of Galicia and Lodomeria had actually declared independence as the West Ukrainian People's Republic. So it was very contentious, and the League of Nations was not sure whether to recognize the newly independent West Ukrainian People's Republic or to just gain support by Poland and just give them all to Poland. So once again we have 4 resolutions here, and we start by the official approach. The Republic of Poland was already greatly expanded by the previous conferences, but this was not even enough, because in this conference they would gain the entirety of both Galicia and Lodomeria, independent of the fact that there were many Ukrainians living in the Lodomeria part of Galicia and Lodomeria, and that Lviv or Lvov, depending on the country, was one of the most important places for the Ukrainians in the West, but also was Polish majority at the time. So for that reason, the first resolution being basically fully in support of Poland. Then the second resolution is the Polish Lviv approach. So as I mentioned, Polish Lviv basically was the ethnic majority of the city of Lviv, and basically in this approach they would have everything west of Lviv given to Poland, and everything else would remain as a recognized, albeit very small, independent West Ukrainian People's Republic. Of course, I doubt that the West Ukrainians would not accept this, but this was an option nonetheless. Then we get to the third approach, the de facto approach, which was exactly what I was mentioning earlier when I said that basically there was already turmoil happening in that area and there were already territories that were occupied by the Polish and by the Ukrainians. In this case, the de facto borders at that point are recognized, which means that the Ukrainian People's Republic of the West is recognized and institutionalized by the League of Nations, and at the same time Poland manages to actually annex the area it was already occupying without having any troubles. And finally, we have one last option, which is the United Independence approach. The entirety of Galicia and Lodomeria, even if it's half occupied by Ukrainians and half occupied by Polish people, is made into a single and new independent state because of its historical presence as a united region. Which means that both the West Ukrainian People's Republic is dismantled and also that the Polish have to retreat from this region and that it will be protected by the League of Nations. Well, if you've been following how this entire simulation is going, you will know what the ambassadors prefer. And of course, that is Poland, winning even this conference and getting the entirety of Galicia and Lodomeria. At this point, Poland won the Eastern Conference, the Western Conference, and even the Southern Conference. The only thing it didn't win was the one with the Baltic States, where it didn't manage to annex Vilnius or the entirety of Lithuania. But honestly, they shouldn't really be mad about it. They're huge. Poland is absolutely dominating in this timeline. Then we get to the fourth conference of Central Europe, the Western Slavs in ex-Austria-Hungary. Here we have 6 resolutions to deal with the problem of the Western Slavs. A bit of pretext for this, basically Czechia, especially Czechia, was an integral part of Austria for centuries. It had been part of Austria for probably at least 3 or 4 centuries, maybe even more before this war even happened, which meant that it was very Germanized. A lot of its population was German, especially in the land we call the Sudetenland, which is basically encircling the entirety of Czechia. And at the same time, Slovakia was very much inhabited by a lot of Hungarians. Even the National Socialist Party, so the Nazis basically, was a party that originated in Czechia by the Sudeten Germans, which felt that they were being treated worse than the Czech majority. Now let's actually look at the resolutions themselves. So the first one is the official approach. Both Czechia and Slovakia in their territorial entirety are united and independent. Though the Hungarian and German minorities will get autonomy, they will still be considered part of the Czechoslovak state. Then we have the Czech and Slovak independence approach. Same thing as before, but instead of uniting the Czechs and Slovaks, they remain independent. The third approach is the one that sees a regionalist approach. Here we have the Moravian Republic, the People's Republic of Carpathian Ruthenia, the Slovakian Republic and the Czech Republic all being independent and being created as new independent states, although there were no real ethnic boundaries respected by this approach because the borders would be made out of regional historic borders. The fourth approach is the more interesting now. We have the German-Austria approach. So for those that do not know, this is kind of a de facto approach. At the point of the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Germans declared the formation of German Austria, which was not just an independent state for Austria, but a planned state that would be united with Germany at that point in time in the future. It not only held the territories of modern-day Austria, but also more parts of Slovenia and more parts of Czechia, with the entirety of the Sudetenland being claimed by the German Austrian Republic. Finally, we have two last options, Lesser Slovakia approach and an ethnocentric approach. The Lesser Slovakia approach is the one that has to do with Slovakia. Well, in the last approach, we've seen that basically Czechia gets the worst hand at the table and gets this kind of like reduced in territory because the Sudetenland goes with German Austria. In this approach is Slovakia, partitioned between the Hungarians and the West Ukrainian People Republic, which at this point was not sure whether it would exist or not. Finally, we have one last option, the ethnocentric approach. In this option, Czechoslovakia remains as a united state, but its borders are completely altered. Northern parts of the Sudetenland are given to Germany. The southern parts of the Sudetenland are given to Austria, which is forbidden from uniting with Germany, but is still granted more territories in this area. The area known as Burgenland is left for a plebiscite. This area was the one between the Germans and the Hungarians of the empire, which was German majority but had been part of the Kingdom of Hungary for the majority of history. Finally, the West Ukrainian People's Republic still manages to annex the area of the Rusyns, maybe creating a new and independent Russian state. And the Hungarian majority parts of Slovakia are united with Hungary. These were 6 very interesting options. Each of them had its own perks and its own interesting outcomes. But what I was really surprised about was the one that won. Out of all these options, the winning one was number 1. The one that everybody knows has brought to the German ultimatum on Czechoslovakia, the Munich Accords, all those chaoses and problems that were caused by this part of the world was going to be respected once more because the ambassadors chose number 1, independent, united and completely territorially integral Czechoslovakia. Now let's move to the next conference, the 5th conference, the one for Italy. So it comes to no surprise that I'm kind of biased when it comes to Italy, so I gave it 8 options, because I know more about its history when it comes to the Adriatic borders. But that said, the results will probably shock you. The 8 options given to Italy are the ones that have to do with the Italian effort on the Alpine front. Basically what happened in World War I was that after Italy joined the war, there were continuous battles on the Alpine front, which meant in the mountains, in the cold and freezing mountains of the Alps. And these battles were mostly lost by Italy, but eventually they managed to take ground and win against the Austro-Hungarians after the Austro-Hungarian Empire started collapsing at the end of the war. The Italians were given basically a reason to enter the war by the British and the French, which signed a secret treaty called the Treaty of London, where they promised Italy several territories, these being the region called South Tyrol and Trentino, the region called Istria, the region called Northern Dalmatia, and more concessions in Albania and other minor cities. All of these were the reasons why Italy joined the war on the side of Entente instead of remaining neutral, since Italy in fact joined not in 1914 when the war started, but in 1915, a year later. Out of all of these options, we will see that not all of them respect the London Treaty. This is because in our own timeline, the London Treaty was not respected. It was the reason why Italy felt like the mutilated victory was taking place, which is a concept in Italian history which meant that Italy's own allies in the war betrayed Italy and all its dead soldiers have died for nothing, or at least not enough, since Italy just got half of the things that it was promised. As we can see by the first of these resolutions, the official approach, this is what Italy actually got. It got Trentino, an Italian majority region, it got South Tyrol, a German majority region, it got Istria, an Italian majority region, and then it did not get Northern Dalmatia, instead only getting the city of Zara, which was in fact Italian majority in Dalmatia. Additionally to this, an independent and free state was created in Fiume, which is nowadays called Rijeka by the Croatians. The city was Italian majority at the time, but it was not part of the London Treaty, which meant that Italy had no absolute claim with it, and since it was a very large and influential port, the newly established Kingdom of Yugoslavia really wanted it. Therefore, the free city was created to prevent war between the two powers. Then we have the second option. This is where the London Treaty is confirmed, and this approach sees exactly what I mentioned earlier. All the things I mentioned and all the territories that were promised to Italy are actually given to Italy, meaning the concept of vittoria mutilata or mutilated victory is never brought up. Then we have the third option, the Italian ambitions achieved option. This does not have to do anything with the London Treaty, since it only made some Italians happy. Many Italians, especially the nationalist kind, wanted all of Dalmatia and all of the Adriatic coast from Montenegro all the way to Istria to become part of the Italian kingdom for its efforts in the war. The fourth option is the historical borders one, or also called the restoration approach. This one sees newly made borders of the Italian kingdom are based on the historical regions that were part of the Italian pre-unification states, which means that Trento, or the Archbishopric of Trent, is made an Italian region, as well as the part of Istria and Dalmatia, which were ruled by the Venetian Serenissima Republic, which was an independent Italian Venetian state which existed for millennia. Finally, the Republic of Ragusa, which used to be a Dalmatian state on the Dalmatian coast, an independent republic, is remade independent under Italian mandate. The fifth option is the ethnocentric approach. While it is true that the Italians felt mutilated victory was taking place after the end of the war in our timeline, realistically, the territories they had territorially given claims by the majority of the population of the area were not that many. They had Trent, they had Istria and Trieste, they had Fiume, they had Zara, they had Sebenico, and they had some islands. But apart from that, the rest of the territories had become majority Slavic, South Slavic, Croatian mostly, because of the Slavicization population policies the Austro-Hungarian Empire implemented at the end of the 19th century to reduce Italian influence in its own regions. The sixth approach is the punishing Italy approach. Since Italy failed a lot of times, and the 12 battles of the Isonzo River were a failure for Italy, some of the ambassadors of the Entente figured out that Italy was not a good ally, and therefore, while of course giving it something for their efforts in the war, they shouldn't give them anything more than a simple participation trophy. For this region, only parts of Trento, Grado, and some parts of Istria are given to Italy, but everything else they wanted and what they were promised are not even touched. Then we have the seventh option, the de facto approach. At the end of the war, by Germany's surrender, Italy was already occupying much of what it desired from Austria-Hungary. They were occupying most of South Tyrol, even all the way up to Innsbruck, which was the capital of the Tyrol region of Austria-Hungary. They were occupying most of coastal urban Dalmatia and all of Istria, including the city of Fiume. If these borders were made into reality, these were the territories that Italy would have annexed. Finally, we have the eighth option, the French plans for Italy approach. This option sees a complete remodeling of the borders of the region. In fact, not only Italy gets completely different borders from those that they were promised to them, but it gets even more land than they asked for. They get Lika, Gospic, most of Slovenia, the entirety of South and North Tyrol, Trento, Istria, but they don't get anything in Dalmatia. Additionally, the area known as Vorarlberg, which used to be part of Austria, is made into a Swiss canton. Out of these 8 options, one more diverse from the other. Can you guess which one won? Well, it sure surprised me. It was the third option, the Italians' ambitions achieved approach, which meant there would be many problems between Italy and Yugoslavia in the future. Talking about Yugoslavia, let's actually get to the 6th conference, the Northern Balkans. This conference has to do with the lands that we now call Yugoslavia, the places inhabited by the South Slavic people of the Balkans. In our timeline, the London Treaty was also signed by the Serbians, which were part of the Entente. The Serbians fought to gain access to the entirety of Bosnia, most of southern Dalmatia, and other liminal lands. They wanted to expand their territories even in Albania. They also were followed by the Montenegrins, another minor power of the area that fought alongside the Serbians. These 6 resolutions see the following. The first is the Catholic and Orthodox approach. Since Croats and Serbs are divided mainly by their religion, Catholic for the Croatians and Orthodox for the Serbians, then 2 states for Slavic people in the south should be made. One is the already existing Serbia, which should be expanded in the north, in territories where Slavic people exist but are not the explicit majority, where they can repopulate them with the people coming from the south. Therefore, the entirety of the Banat Republic, as well as Baranja and even Pax, should become part of Serbia. On the other side, the state of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, a Catholic majority state, should be created in the rest of the ex-Austro-Hungarian parts of Yugoslavia. The state, while being friends with Serbia, should remain separate. Croatian and Slovene majority. The second option is a strategic and ethnic approach. This approach sees an expansion of the Serbian state, but not that much compared to what it wanted. It does not get any parts of Dalmatia, only gets a part of Bosnia, and in the north only gets a part of Vojvodina. Furthermore, Montenegro would be compensated way more than expected. It would gain the entirety of Herzegovina, as well as the parts that we now call Ragusa or Dubrovnik, and it would even expand inside of Serbia itself, as a compensation for its efforts in the war. Finally, the rest of Yugoslavia would be turned into a united kingdom of Croats and Slovenes. The third resolution is the moderate approach. Here, while indeed Serbia has to be rewarded territories for its participation and efforts in the war, we must remember Woodrow Wilson's 14 points on ethnic right to self-govern of nations. For this region, Serbia will annex the entirety of Bosnia, but nothing more. Croatia and Slovenia will be rendered independent and united states by the Serbs, the Hungarians, the Germans, or the Italians. Then we have 2 approaches that have to do with the concept of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, as many of you already know, was the union of the entirety of the South Slavs, except for Bulgaria. Under Yugoslavia, the concept was the unity of South Slavs was more important than the single desires of the ethnicities that made it. Resolution 4 is the official approach. Yugoslavia is made, annexing Vojvodina, the entirety of Slovenia, the entirety of Croatia, and Serbia becomes part of it. The 5th approach is even greater to that. It's a greater Yugoslavia approach, where Yugoslavia not only exists, but it also annexes the entirety of Baranja, more territories in southern Carinthia, and also parts of Banat. The final of these resolutions is the London Treaty confirmed approach, where Serbia is the big winner. It becomes Greater Serbia, while Croatia and Slovenia are rendered independent, but very small and minor. The only problem is that since Italy has annexed the entirety of the Dalmatian coastline, Serbia does not get sea access unless it gets it through Montenegro. Out of all of these 6 resolutions, the one that won was surprisingly number 1. In fact, I think people in hindsight preferred giving the option to divide from the get-go Croatia and Slovenia from Serbia because of reasons that were only being decided in hindsight, ergo the independent state of Croatia in World War II and its atrocities, or maybe the Yugoslavian civil war at the end of the 20th century. Anyways, for these reasons, number 1 won, and 2 states were created for the South Slavic people, except for Montenegro, of course. Finally, the last conference we will look at today is the conference for the region of Burgenland. Burgenland, as I mentioned earlier, is the place between Austria and Hungary, and while its majority population is indeed German, its status was always been a part of the Kingdom of Hungary. For these reasons, the 4 options given are number 1, the situation remains as was historical, so the territory of Burgenland remains completely in Hungary. The number 2, as Austria annexes the entirety of Burgenland since it is German majority. Number 3, the territory is divided between the Germans and the Hungarians as it is in real life. This is the official approach since the entirety of Burgenland was not given to Austria, but instead the southernmost part was given to Yugoslavia, the easternmost part was given to Hungary, this being the city of Sopron, and the rest was given to Austria. Finally, there is a 4th and extremely weird approach where the entire territory is given to Czechoslovakia, since the idea of a Czechoslovak corridor that could unite the West Slavs to the South Slavs was proposed in order to divide permanently the Magyars from the Austrians. Out of these 4 options, the one that won was number 2, so the pro-German sentiment, while kind of dying down compared to earlier, is still definitely present, since the people decided to give Austria the land even more than it got in our timeline. With that done, I can finally say we've finished this video. So let me know, what would you actually have done, what would you have chosen, would you have voted for in these resolutions if you were part of the ambassadors of these treaties of Versailles, Sykes-Picot, and so on and so forth. And tell me if you look forward to part 2, because in fact there are all the other treaties of the world that will be for the Ottoman Empire, that will be for the rest of Arabia, for the African front, for the Asian front, and from the rest of the Balkans that we still have to work on, and that in its entirety will make up the next part of this video, if this video gets enough recognition. So comment down below to help the algorithm spread this video and tell me if you liked it. Thanks for watching, and you will see each other next time.